Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. There's a certain category of disaster, whether it's man-made or natural, that poses an existential threat to humanity. These are called global catastrophic risks. Some of these are fairly obvious, like nuclear war. Some may seem more the realm of science fiction, like an asteroid impact. My guest today, Jens Orback, is the CEO of the Global Challenges Foundation, a Sweden-based group that is seeking to prevent these catastrophes through enhanced international cooperation. The Global Challenges Foundation recently released a report identifying global catastrophic risks and the current means of international cooperation or global governance to deal with them. This includes nuclear warfare, biological and chemical warfare, catastrophic climate change, ecological collapse, pandemics, asteroid impact, supervolcanic eruptions, and the misuse of artificial intelligence, among others. What binds each of these risks is not only their potential to destroy humanity, but also that they can be mitigated through stronger international cooperation. This actually includes asteroid impact, which I was surprised to learn is something that a number of countries are collectively working on today. I think you'll appreciate this episode. I've long been a fan of the Global Challenges Foundation and their effort to push the envelope on strengthening global governance. And I do personally find the frame of global catastrophic risk as a useful one in which to explore new methods of international cooperation. And before we start the show, a quick note from World Vision. If you're interested in hearing more about topical global issues, check out Rising to Respond, a podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes for humanitarians to fight COVID-19 around the world. Brought to you by World Vision, they're covering stories that you're not seeing in the news. Hear from global leaders, frontline workers, and children about the realities they're facing during this global pandemic. You can find Rising to Respond on your favorite podcast player or visit wvi.org/rising to respond. And now here is my conversation with Jens Orback, CEO of the Global Challenges Foundation.
Well, we define a global catastrophic risk or an existential risk, and that is a risk that could kill more than 10% of the world's population. That's the definition that we have focused on, and I think it has spread a little bit in academia. And then we also have some risks that we put forward, and you can talk about the current risk from human action, and that is weapons of mass destruction, catastrophic climate change, and ecological collapse. And then you have the natural catastrophes like pandemics that we are in now, asteroids, supervolcanic eruptions. And then we also have emerging risks like artificial intelligence. And then, of course, we have unknown risks. So I think we also have to have a architecture of decision-making globally that can also handle unknown risks.
Like we know there is something out there that could be catastrophic. We don't know exactly what that is, but if that emerges, how do we handle it?
Right. I think 100 years ago, we wouldn't think that, or 150 years ago, we wouldn't think of the climate change as a global catastrophic risk. Perhaps we didn't identify ecological collapse either, and for sure not weapons of mass destruction. So in just a short period of 70 years, we are facing these existential risks together.
So it's interesting. Under your definition, the current pandemic, which is not going to kill 10% of the global population, would not qualify as a catastrophic risk. It's just something that's very, very bad.
No, we wouldn't define it as a global catastrophic risk, although it is a risk, and who knows, in the future to come, we might have a pandemic that is more severe, and that could be a global catastrophic risk.
Yeah, like the death rate from COVID-19 is maybe like around 1 or 2%, depending. But if the death rate were 20 or 30% from a pandemic, that would qualify. So I'm wondering, so what does, from your perspective, like the policy response in terms of international cooperation and global governance to COVID-19 suggest to you about the state of global governance and international cooperation to confront a truly catastrophic pandemic?
Well, I would say it's you can see it in different ways. One way, coming from politics, I remember myself then and when saying that, it takes a long time for a government to steer in another direction. It's like a big tanker, but once we have steered in another direction, we are focused and it's going to give a lot of power. But here we have shown that at least on the national level, we can do it very fast, as long as we have the support from the opinion from the people. So from one day to another, we can actually have a new law in the parliament. So that is one thing that has shown a very positive and fast possibility to react on a national level. But I don't think we have seen the same thing on the global level. Rather, actually, the opposite in the beginning, when many of the European countries were actually competing about the masks or other gears to prohibit the spread of COVID-19. So I think we can see different things. And if it comes again, we need, I think, a much more robust global architecture when it comes to decision making.
That's interesting. Is it the nature, perhaps, of pandemic as a catastrophic threat that suggests that national decision-making is key as opposed to international cooperation?
Actually, I don't think it doesn't need to be that way, because a pandemic doesn't care about national borders, as we have seen. And I think we thought for a while that WHO was an organization, one of the organizations in the Bretton Woods system that actually had developed quite a lot in the last years. But now, then we saw that the support for this organization wasn't as strong as we hoped. And also the US had even are thinking of leaving the organization. So I actually think that pandemics is a catastrophe that really needs international cooperation as well.
Why focus on global catastrophic threats? I mean, yes, of course, on the one hand, these threats have the potential to decimate humanity, but on the other hand, the probability of many of them happening is rather low.
I would say that it's a question of survival. I think after the Second World War, there was a big and strong need to build something so that we could say no more wars. And then the UN came. We had the Security Council with some power in it. It could take decisions when it comes to risks, when it's risk of weapons against each other. But in the last 70 years, the interdependence between countries have increased significantly. But at the same time, the system to cooperate around these risks has not risen in the same time. So I think we have a huge risk gap. When interdependence has gone up, the institutions have developed very slow and even lost some of their power lately. So I think there is a big need to cooperate around these global catastrophic risk. And at the bottom line, it's about survival for humankind, because we are threatening our planetary boundaries. We don't know how long the resilience will be from Earth when we are exploring it the way we are, when we have a pattern of consumption and production that is taking more from the Earth than we are giving back. So I think from our founders' point of view, he put his money in this foundation because of the thought of his grandkids and their possibility to survive.
Of all the risks identified in your report, the one that seems to me sort of most obvious as unfolding and perhaps even more likely than not to unfold if current trajectories continue is global warming and the catastrophic consequence of 2 or 3 degrees increase in the next 50 years or so. If that happens, of course, it would represent a horrific failure of our current methods of international cooperation to take on climate change. What would be an example of a different kind of global governance regime that might be able to mitigate global warming?
Well, I'm actually an economist from the start. I started my career at the Ministry for Finance, and I think that the basic problem is that we don't have a pricing for common good. We don't have a price for the rainforest until we have cut it down. We don't have a price for clean air. We don't have a price for clean water. So we haven't put the price on common good that can spread over our borders. And so we have over-explored common good. And I think that is a fundamental problem that the market economy have not been able to solve. Actually, so here we need to have other budgets or other way of measuring the common good, so that there is a price also for an uncut tree in the rainforest.
And I mean, are there mechanisms that exist in global governance to do what you just suggest?
Yes, I would say, but mostly on the national level, and also I would say the European Union is struggling with this, giving some money to the agricultural sector when they also go in a direction that is more sustainable. And but here I sit looking out at the Baltic Sea, for instance, and a fourth of the Baltic Sea is dead. And that comes from our countries around the Baltic Sea. We have not found a way to cooperate around common good, around clean water. And I mean, we have tried for a long time, but still it's dying.
You're a politician. How do you summon the political will to do something about that catastrophic threat? How do you initiated this conversation by talking about like long-term threats. But it seems that we're trapped in near-term thinking.
I think we need rule of law on a global scale. I think we need judicial authority, we need legislative authority, we need executive authority. And I'm a little bit positive about the younger generation who is now asking for stronger institutions when it comes to actually, I think they are thinking about the ICC, ICJ, and Greta, who's a Swede, is talking about ecocide. We need also some sort of laws on the global arena, and we need a court that could see if we have gone too far. And so I think the world risk has to be much broader than a risk of weapons against each other. We have to put in climate changes and ecological collapse when we talk about risks in the future, I think.
And another thing I find really fascinating about your report is that, it identifies some of these sort of natural disaster type events, some that, seem like they would come out of science fiction, like an asteroid impact. But it identifies the fact that there actually are mechanisms of international cooperation already underway. They're kind of nascent, but they exist, at least say in terms of asteroid impact.
Right.
Can you just describe what are those mechanisms of international cooperation on, I believe it's called NearEarth Objects.
Right.
And what does that tell you about the state of, say, global governance more broadly?
Yeah, actually, there is a committee or a body for that, and when it comes to asteroid, they are focusing on an asteroid if it's larger than 50 meters, and if the probability of impact on Earth is greater than 1%, then they will act in one way or another. I'm not an expert in how they will act. There are different views on that, but actually there are bodies on that. I mean, there is a body now talking about AI, but there is also a big political race here. I would think that China is further when it comes to AI and is therefore not as interested in regulating the market.
What makes the asteroid impact example so interesting to me is that, it's just like a very obvious example of something that could decimate humanity. And so the need for international cooperation, seems sort of apparent on its face. And just the fact that through the UN and other mechanisms, there do exist some initial mechanisms of that international cooperation to unfold. But when it comes to AI, as you mentioned, it's a far more sort of geopolitical issue. And so even though perhaps the destructive forces of AI may be more acute than, say, a potential asteroid impact, the ability for the international community to cooperate to mitigate the negative impact of, or the potential negative impact of AI isn't there. So again, it seems that question of like political will.
Right, it is. I think I would say politics, it's a very good tool to handle conflict of interests without violence. But here, when it comes to AI, there is a big conflict of interest, and it has not been solved. And one reason for that is actually that we don't have these stronger institutions to take decisions. I mean, maybe we can come up with some recommendations or that you can follow this voluntarily. But I think at the end of the day, now with these threats, we also need some sort of decision making. And if you have decision making, of course, you also have to have legitimacy. Legitimacy and legality goes hand in hand, of course.
I guess maybe one of the challenges is that the sort of pace of, say, development of AI and its potential to be used for ill is far exceeding the pace of our ability to, marshal the political resources necessary to mitigate that impact. Right, like the pace of AI development is far greater than our political will at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, what we can see today, I think it's the AI. It can handle huge quantity of data. It could identify illnesses. It could develop drugs. It could perhaps help us to track the spread of COVID-19. But the day when it reaches human level of general intelligence, that I think is the big issue and also the big threat and risk.
Yeah, I think that they made a whole Terminator series about that back in the 90s.
Right.
You started this conversation by, saying you have a long-term, time horizon. And these are all about sort of thinking through the long-term threats over the next, say, 100 years. 100 years from now, what would sort of an ideal architecture of global governance and international cooperation look like to you to deal with some of these threats? I mean, you mentioned earlier, enhancing the rule of law to deal with, say, ecological threats. But what about these other kinds of issues and even natural disasters like, say, supervolcanic eruptions? How would international cooperation in ideal form be able to confront that, say, 100 years from now?
Actually, I don't think we have the time to wait for 100 years. But if I would describe it, I would go back to some sort of rule of law. I mean, there was a day when the village that I'm sitting here at now could not cooperate with the village next to it. But once they build a road, they have to cooperate on that. They had to cooperate on how they would take up the fishes. And then there was a lot of protests. How should they cooperate with a municipality or our big city, Stockholm? And how should Stockholm then cooperate with the rest of the country or with the European Union? And the development have actually been that the cooperation has to be founded also on some sort of rule of law. I think if we should take a decision, for instance, on a global tax for carbon dioxide, then we need to also have some sort of decision architecture. And then we need to have some sort of legitimacy also in such an organization. If it's the UN, I think we might need another chamber in the General Assembly that is more in connection with people and not governments. We need to have a stronger system of courts, international courts, that could say that this, what you have done in that country, is a big threat to climate changes or ecological collapses, for instance. I think we need some sort of improved rule of law on the global scene, because we have so many issues together and we need to solve them with that kind of instruments.
It's almost like your report sets up this potential race between a catastrophe that kills 10% of the world's population and the international community's ability to build mechanisms and structures to prevent that or mitigate its impact.
Yes, and I think that where we are right now is in this risk gap. We have the catastrophes, we have the interdependence, but we don't have these institutions. And there we see the risk gap.
Well, Jens, thank you so much for your conversation and for the report, which really, I think, provides a really interesting kind of heuristic to understand global governance and also just international cooperation and risks more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Jens. And as I mentioned at the outset, I've long been an admirer of the Global Challenges Foundation. A couple of years ago, they partnered with a podcast around a series of episodes around an ideas competition that they had seeking new models for global governance. It was a really interesting experience, and in the couple of years since, it's been neat to see some of these ideas start to come to life around the United Nations and elsewhere. And I'll post a link to my conversation with one of the winners of that competition, Natalie Samarsinha, in the show notes of this episode if you're interested. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.